All right, welcome everybody to session 3, Perspectives. The focus of this session will be on migration, mental health, and inclusion in the transborder region. I'm the facilitator for this session. My name is Dr. Shira Goldenberg. I'm an assistant professor in the Division of Epidemiology and Biostatistics here in the School of Public Health at San Diego State University. I use she, her pronouns. And I'm honored and delighted to be facilitating this session today. We have an exciting panel prepared for all of you. Just a few logistics before we begin. I'd like to just remind audience members to please submit your questions and comments through the messages function. So before we begin, I wanted to introduce the panelists for today. I just wanted to begin with a little bit of high-level framing for the conversation today. My research focuses on migrant and women's health equity, and I focus on the impacts of structural policies and social inequities. I'd like to begin the session just with a little bit of an overview of current issues related to migration, mental health, and binational inclusion in our transporter region. This session's panelists address a diverse range of interrelated topics, from the mental health of asylum seekers to issues of inclusion and belonging in the transporter region, as well as applied examples of ways we can promote mental health in the training of bilingual educators who support our diverse communities. I would argue that there's a need for attention to mental health and inclusion that's really greater than ever before. As we've already heard about during the meeting today, the co-occurring crises of COVID-19, exclusionary immigration policies and practices, border closures, social isolation, and the family separation that families and communities have endured for many years now have profound impacts on mental health and inclusion, and we need to be working actively to try to mitigate those challenges and advocate for policy improvements. One of the pieces that I wanted to emphasize is the way in which these issues impacting our border region are really connected to broader national and global trends. As you can see here, this is a report from the WHO that came out several months ago. And it reported on a survey of over 30,000 refugees and migrants from different regions around the world and assessed the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on their mental and physical health, as well as their ability to work and support themselves. Survey respondents were asked to grade the impact of the pandemic on a scale from 0 to no impact to 10, having an extreme impact. And the average impact assessment that migrants and refugees reported was a 7.5, so very high. So I would argue that mental health and related public health inequities are really a global issue that does manifest very much in unique ways within our border region. And the second point I wanted to make is just the way in which these are deeply shaped by policy. Obviously we have seen particularly extreme examples of immigration policies and rhetoric that are rooted in xenophobia and racism under the Trump administration. For example, family separations, the conflation of immigration with criminal activity, and other deeply harmful narratives that are divisive and obviously very politicized in nature. What I would argue is that these policies have an ongoing legacy. Xenophobic immigration policy and its connections to public health, for example, are really well illustrated by Title 42, which is a public health instrument which allows for people to be expelled at the border under the basis of a public health claim around contagion. And this was used under the Trump administration for the first time in a unique way during the COVID pandemic to basically keep people out of the country. What I thought would be relevant to the audience is just to be aware that there have been recent congressional hearings where CDC officials, including the CDC's deputy director under the Trump administration, which admitted that these were not based on a public health assessment. Yet the Biden administration has retained the policy and continues to describe it as a public health measure. So there's current litigation over the measure, which is important because right now as the US border has been opening to vaccinated travelers, it's really exclusionary in terms of the way that this is being disproportionately applied to more precarious migrants, to folks who are fleeing for their lives, and is very class-based in terms of the ways that asylum policy and migration policy are currently being rolled out. So there have been calls from medical professionals as well as other organizations to end this policy, and we're hoping to see movement on that soon. So that's something to be aware of that I think is just really of relevance in terms of framing some of the conversation today, especially around asylum seekers. One other point to note is that the Biden administration has actually now expelled far more migrants under this act than the Trump administration had. So this has really prompted cries from immigration advocates that this policy is illegally blocking those with the legal right to seek asylum in the US and needs to be urgently ended. The good news, despite all of these really difficult policy challenges and the xenophobic climate that we continue to see, is just the ways in which community advocacy, hope, and resilience continue to rise up and bolster communities despite these challenges. I have worked in Tijuana for many years and have just been so moved by the community grassroots efforts and by national organizations that work so hard and so tirelessly to support communities. All the way from migrant shelters to legal aid organizations such as Al Otro Lado that provides, essential advocacy and legal support to folks navigating the asylum process, to housing, emergency relief, support for the Haitian migrants that have been in Tijuana in recent years, and other support efforts. And the community works, very closely together to try to buttress some of these impacts. So I'm looking forward to hearing the research of the panelists, and then at the end of the presentations, we'll have time for a group discussion. We welcome questions from the audience, and we'll be asking each panelist as well at the end to describe some kind of next steps and a little bit of a summary statement from their work. So without further ado, I'm delighted to welcome our distinguished panelists for today. So the first panelist will be speaking on forced migration, childhood adversity, and post-traumatic stress disorder. And Dr. Esperanza Camargo is a professor in the Department of Criminal Justice here at San Diego State University. Next, we'll have a presentation from Emma Alvarez, who's a PhD student at the Tijuana Technological Institute, who is co-authored with Drs. Leonardo Trujillo Reyes and Dr. Ieta Rotio Borges Chapela on graph-based analysis of migrant polling data of people at the border, which is guaranteed to be a very interesting presentation. And then I believe our third presenter, unfortunately, isn't able to make it, but the last presentation is titled Rumbo a un sistema responsable de apoyo estudiantil, promoviendo la salud mental en la formación de docentes bilingües. And this is being presented by Dr. Saul Maldonado, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Dual Language and English Learner Education here at SDSU. They are joined by Sarah Jean Hernandez, who is an assistant professor of dual language and English learner education also at SDSU, as well as Mariano Lozano Soto, who is a doctoral student in the SDSU Claremont Graduate University Joint PhD program in education, as well as co-author Michael Wicker, who is a professor of English and education and coordinator of liberal studies and teacher education at Southwestern Community College District. So for the discussion, we're also pleased to be joined by Lisandra Perez, who is a SDSU graduate research student who will be helping moderate the discussion. So please do post your questions in the chat when that time in the presentation comes. And I look forward to hearing from everyone. And we'll go ahead now and open things up to our first presenter, Dr. Camargo. Please feel free to take it away.
Thank you. And let me share my screen. So is that okay? Okay, perfect. So I'm Esperanza Camargo. I'm an assistant professor of criminal justice at San Diego State University. And I'm talking about forced migration, childhood adversity, and post-traumatic stress disorder. And I just want to call your attention on this expression of forced migration, because I think we have to make a distinction between what is migration and the migration that is caused by factors that are not under control of the individuals. And so in the structural factors and that cause migration, or better, the migration that is forced by different factors should be defined as that, as forced migration, because it is not voluntary, as many may say. So in this study, I analyzed the association between childhood adversity and post-traumatic stress disorder. And basically, my main argument is that the conditions endured by migrants, the adverse conditions, let's say, that migrants endure are or start well before they start the journey to tour the United States. Now, I'm a criminologist. So my perspective in this is my approach, let's say, is first of all, the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights mandates its states members to guarantee the rights and dignity of their citizens. And also the social harm, which is also called human rights perspective, is states, it is from the critical criminology, and it states that the states are responsible for specific crimes because they do not act or by action or inaction. So basically is the fact that the states fail to provide the conditions for their citizens to develop their or reach their full development. And the adverse childhood experience is a phenomena that has been studied more or less in the United States, specifically Minnesota and Philadelphia. And in Minnesota, the Department of Health basically defines adverse childhood experience as traumatic experience in a person's occurrence before the age of 18 that the person recalls as an adult. So, and then it recognizes or acknowledges that there is a long life serious consequences of that childhood experience. So this, for this study, we surveyed 97 asylum seekers at Mexicali, which is US border, and in 2019. And I just want to acknowledge that the surveys were conducted by the collaboration between San Diego State University and Universidad Autónoma de Baja California in Mexicali. So we work with faculty at the UABC and students, and we survey asylum seekers in 4 shelters in Mexicali. And we did the contribution, let's say, for gaining the authorization to reach this population. Our students work with children, for example. Some events were created for the children that were in the shelters. We promote some donations and to provide some services that they needed desperately by then. So this sample, in this sample, we found that 66% were men and 34% women. And here we can see how most of women were between 25 and 44 years old. Only very few were between 18 and 24, but we can see that more men are in that range in between really 18 and 24. So we can kind of see that difference in between men and women. Again, more men and younger men, let's say. About the country of origin in this sample illustrates we found the similar or same countries that other studies have shown, previous studies had shown. We found the Honduras, the most of these people were from Honduras, 45%, then Guatemala and El Salvador. So basically, we found, as previous study has shown, that from the North Triangle, the United States kind of receive most of these asylum seekers. And to conduct this study, I use kind of a combination or adapted 3 scales: the Harvard Trauma Questionnaire, the Adverse Childhood Experience, and the Conflict-Active Scales, and you will see which items I included. So 33 indicators and 7 scales I use. So childhood physical and emotional abuse, household dysfunction, neighborhood violence, and school violence. And then the 3 forms of post-traumatic stress disorder. So as we kind of try to know who are those migrants, we found that, first of all, many, 37% felt or were abandoned by their father, 22% by the mother, and 38% of this in this sample was in foster care at some time in their childhood. And just think about that, it is relatively, or has been discussed, that children, when parents migrate or go to jail or are not present, some families take care of them, but also in the sample we found that some friends, close friends of the family may have take the children. And we also, I also found that this in this sample, many of them, 71%, really experience hunger at some point. So we asked about if they have experienced or they had not have 3 meals per day in sometimes during the childhood, that 71% did say that they didn't have 3 meals per day all the time, or that experience hunger at some point. I also asked about housing and the quality of housing, and if the place where they live had the utilities like water, electricity in those, and 57% say that at some point in their life they didn't have those utilities in the place they live, and 8% didn't have education, non-education. And it is important, I think, to read. These are the words of one interviewee, that she was from Honduras, a woman like around 40 something. And basically she, when I interviewed her, she told me how she was sexually abused. She was forced out her home because at age 9, because the mother, her mother, blamed her for the sexual abuse. And so then how she grew up in a physically abusive foster care family, and then she gets married, and this relationship is abusive. Then she is also a victim of criminal gangs and extortion. And finally, she leaves her country, Honduras, and then she say, how is it possible that, you know, I'm here for months and this is becoming the worst nightmare all. So it somehow, this person shows us how all of these traumatic events happen to one person, and relatively young. We are talking about a woman around 40s. So about emotional and physical abuse, we found also a high percentage of this sample that reported that he or she were abused. So emotional abuse and physical abuse. In both cases, I will not stop in a single one indicator, but you can see that the average is around 25% of these events that they suffer. Household dysfunction is less, or has been less studied. And I think it is very important for this population specifically, because when we talk about migration and emigration and displacement and forced migration, we have to think about what are the conditions in which they live. And they live in, for example, in households in which somebody other than their parents serve time, so 17%, 15% of them reported that their father was in prison at some time or served time. 14% live with someone who was suicidal, then or depressed. The depression is really high. And so we have all of these dysfunctional events in families. And I don't want to say that those are so atypical. The atypical is that those occur at the same time than hunger and abandonment and all of those. So it's almost the combination on all of these traumatic effects that is my argument that affects this population specifically. They are exposed, the exposure to violence is higher. If you see how school violence and neighborhood violence, we have people who were, for example, forced by a criminal group to change appearance. And this is very important in my research, because 21%, almost 21% of people say that those women. And it is a very important victimization, because we have to kind of acknowledge that there are criminal gangs on those and cartels, and women are specifically victimized, sexual abuse, but also used as, all kind of cleaning and things for the gang. But not only that, but they are controlled, their appearance, whatever they wear or how, are controlled by the gangs. And this is very, very important. Violence against, a type of violence against women that I think hasn't been studied enough. And in the neighborhood, the same thing. Somebody has been or has felt threatened. They saw or heard someone being beaten up or stabbed, and about property crimes. And again, the 77% of these in this sample were victims of property crimes, and it was how they felt was that they didn't have any protection from police or the government in any way. It's like they do not have a place to get help or protection. And the indicators of post-traumatic stress disorder, I have this, so hyperarousal, this avoidance and intrusion, and again, it is really high in comparison with other populations, but just think about almost 51% of the population just cannot focus, have difficulty to concentrate in any activity. They feel really jumpy, easily startled. They really, really feel have all of this kind of mental anxiety and mental trauma. And just think about that they do not have anybody who can help them with this, to deal with these conditions. So I just want to kind of show in general, my results in general show that the childhood adversity, child emotional and physical abuse, the household dysfunction, neighborhood dysfunction, and school violence are all directly correlated to post-traumatic stress disorder in the three categories. So, but it's also important to keep in mind that household dysfunction and neighborhood violence was the highest. So it is, we put, and rightly so, put a lot of attention about family dysfunction, domestic abuse, child abuse, and this. But if we think about this population, household dysfunction and neighborhood violence is the highest. The trauma that most affect or are associated to or predict post-traumatic stress disorder, and therefore we should think about those. So for the discussion, I just want to say this. Yeah, according to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, states are guarantors of preserving the rights and dignity of their citizens. Clearly, in this sample, we can say that those states, the countries from they come, fail to protect their citizens. And the articles in the Declaration of Human Rights, the articles 3, 25, and 26 are related to the rights to education, life, liberty, and security. Those states basically fail to provide a protection and to provide opportunities to leave poverty. Poverty in El Salvador, for example, and all of these three countries, but specifically in El Salvador, are severe poverty. It's like, when we talk about poverty, is about 100% of certain neighborhoods that do not have drinking water. And so it is very important. And I think for us, it's very important to start talking about in more detail, because we may say poverty, but poverty doesn't mean the same to everybody. So we have to talk about poverty, violence, for example. It doesn't mean the same for everybody, because it's different to kind of face certain property crime at some point in life, but this population face threats, sexual violence, kidnappings, killing. So it is much more complicated than just to say violence. And all of this childhood adversity is correlated or predicts post-traumatic stress disorder. So I think for the next steps, we have to talk about the root causes of migration. We have to talk about migration not as an individual decision. They don't make the decision just because I want to go to get education. No, it is a collective decision because they experience so much trauma in their communities that it is just not, that is not options. You know, when we talk about migration, it's like, I decided to go to another country and look for education. No, this is not the case. The case is they are forced to leave their communities because the conditions are very harsh. So I will, of course, answer any questions. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Dr. Camargo. We appreciate your talk. I'd like to ask the audience, please, to just hold your questions until all of the presentations are finished, and then we'll have time for group discussion at the end. So I just wanted to ask a quick question. Do we have anyone from our second presentation group here for the graph-based analysis of migrant polling data? Is that you on the line, Dr. Bojorquez? All right, I'm gonna just call it one more time. Is Dr. Reyes or Dr. Bojorquez Chapela on the line? Okay, if not, I'm going to go ahead to the next presentation. I also believe, do we have Dr. Zamora Garcia here? Okay, I'm going to move along to our fourth presentation. If the other panelists are here, please chat me and I'll make sure that you get to present after the next presenter. So please, Dr. Maldonado, I'll let you and your team take it away.
Good afternoon. My name is Linda Sotelo. I'm honored to be here with you today and share this space with you. I'm the Administrative Bilingual Coordinator for the Developing Effective Bilingual Educators with Resources project, also known as DEBER. DEBER is a grant-funded professional development project that is making an impact in the lives of many students that are pursuing their bilingual teaching credentials. This is possible due to the collaboration of the DEBER leadership, which is composed of campus administrators, faculty, and staff from partnering institutions. The DEBER is designed to support future bilingual teachers that are currently enrolled at Southwestern College, San Diego Mesa College, and San Diego City College in their transfer process to undergraduate programs and to SCSU for the completion of their bilingual credential. The DEBER recently added a few scholars from the SCSU, Liberal Studies, and Chicana Studies programs who are also pursuing their bilingual teacher credentials. Students that onboard with DEBER are referred to as DEBER scholars. The DEBER scholars community is composed of the DEBER leadership and scholars from SDSU, Southwestern College, San Diego City College, and San Diego Mesa College. We onboarded a total of 64 scholars in the fall of 2021. We have scholars from within and beyond the San Diego County. We will be onboarding more scholars in the spring of 2022. DEBER is designed to facilitate the transfer from 2 to 4 year institutions for Hispanic students pursuing an elementary or secondary school teaching credential with a bilingual authorization by providing them with the necessary support, which is institutional, academic, financial support, and resources to help them persist, graduate, and get hired in high demand and high need schools. In addition to professional development opportunities in the field of bilingual education and community building activities with other scholars, our scholars receive ongoing advice, support with degree and credential program requirements, and a stipend each program year. Thank you.
Muy buenas tardes a todos. Es un honor estar aquí compartiendo este espacio con la audiencia de DEBER en el área de investigación y de evaluación. Hoy voy a hablar un poco sobre los marcos teóricos que el liderazgo de DEBER ha utilizado para conducir evaluaciones internas y implementar las políticas que forman parte del proyecto. Como pueden ver en la pantalla, son dos marcos que realmente han guiado la visión del proyecto. Tenemos por un lado el de riqueza cultural de Soto, haciendo énfasis en 4 de los 6 formas de capital que menciona. Y por otro lado también tenemos el de las tipologías de instituciones que sirven a estudiantes hispanos de Gina García. Aquí nuestro enfoque es alcanzar ese cuadrante que es de Latinx Serving. Sabemos que aquí la cuestión de la traducción es un poco compleja, pero este concepto de servir, ¿no? O de serving, es una institución que está capacitada para servir a estudiantes que se identifican como hispanos, es aquella que logra alcanzar un balance entre los indicadores académicos, como son las calificaciones, porcentaje de graduación y retención, y por otro, los indicadores no académicos, que es la valoración lingüística, el reconocimiento de la cultura del estudiante, la creación de climas y de espacios que alienten un sentido de pertenencia. Son esos indicadores no académicos que el proyecto de ver enfatiza mucho. El proyecto en sí no es una institución, se puede decir que sí es una colaboración interinstitucional y es por eso que el liderazgo decidió utilizar estos marcos que reflejen los valores del proyecto. Rápidamente, en relación a la cuestión de salud mental, ¿no? Es por eso que, sobre todo en tiempos de la pandemia, se enfatizó mucho este concepto de cómo se puede mantener la comunicación con los becarios, cómo se puede lidiar con el estrés a través de prácticas que sean culturalmente responsables y al mismo tiempo desarrollar sus capacidades y habilidades como futuros docentes y eso es lo que el proyecto, basándose, anclándose en estos marcos teóricos, ha logrado hacer hasta el momento, creo, de manera bastante eficiente. Gracias.
Saludos cordiales desde tierras Tipay, Ipay o Cumeyay. Es un honor y privilegio compartir este espacio virtual con líderes del equipo de VER. Me llamo Saúl Isaac Maldonado. Gracias por acompañarnos hoy. Un saludo especial a las estudiantes y líderes de DEVER, a nuestras familias y nuestras amistades y gracias a nuestros colegas que nos apoyan en estructurar nuestras ponencias y también en las interpretaciones en múltiples idiomas. Entre los 64 estudiantes y los 18 líderes del proyecto DEVER, tenemos colegas estudiantes y líderes que viven en Baja California. Nuestras investigaciones analizan cómo promover la salud mental en la formación de docentes bilingües. Algunos resultados son: un sentido de pertenencia estudiantil amortigua el estrés y la ansiedad. Usamos encuestas, entrevistas y reflexiones escritas para evaluar la salud mental y el bienestar de los estudiantes, el desarrollo de la identidad racial étnica, el autoconcepto académico y el sentido de pertenencia. Una estudiante compartió en una entrevista: es difícil pedir ayuda por orgullo. Tengo miedo de que me juzguen. Los resultados específicamente asociados con COVID son más obligaciones familiares, más trabajo, muertes en las familias, internet inestable y profes asignando más trabajo virtualmente que durante el aprendizaje presencial. Otro resultado de nuestras investigaciones es que el desarrollo profesional tiene que ser binacional, interdisciplinario e interinstitucional. En la pantalla ven una imagen de 6 personas representando múltiples instituciones como un equipo. Ese equipo ha crecido a 18. Nuestros estudiantes viven en Tijuana y otras partes de Baja California. Una estudiante caracterizó la situación como un cambio de tiempo por un costo de vida reducido. Hemos estructurado participación en la conferencia Reborder 2020 y también este año en Reborder 2021 como parte de nuestras actividades de aprendizaje. Una estudiante compartió en entrevistas: quiero llevar la comprensión de la cultura de la frontera a mis futuros estudiantes. 2 recomendaciones para considerar como una comunidad binacional y crear un sistema responsable de apoyo estudiantil. Número 1, nuestras instituciones educativas binacionales deberíamos valorar auténticamente varios idiomas. Y nuestras instituciones educativas binacionales deberíamos comprometernos a colaborar interinstitucionalmente. Gracias.
Well, thank you very much to the team for this excellent presentation. Oh, is there another presenter?
There is.
Please go ahead.
There are 3 more, or 2 more, just so you know. Thank you.
Wonderful.
Okay.
Take your time.
Gracias. Buenas tardes. Mi nombre es Sara Hernández y soy facultad en la Universidad Estatal de San Diego y un líder del proyecto Deber. Uno de los objetivos del proyecto es proporcionar actividades de aprendizaje profesional que aumenten el interés de los becarios en la educación y la conciencia sobre el camino del docente bilingüe. Una forma de hacerlo es ofreciendo eventos virtuales cada mes que respondan a las necesidades y fortalezas culturales y lingüísticas de los becarios y estén cuidadosamente planificados por un equipo de líderes del proyecto. Escuchamos a invitados como formadores de docentes bilingües, autores de libros infantiles bilingües, biculturales y binacionales, y docentes bilingües actualmente en escuelas. Ahora les comparto un breve video de lo que estamos haciendo para conectar a nuestros becarios con una comunidad de educadores bilingües que los apoyará en su búsqueda de la credencial bilingüe. Y me gustaría agradecer a Javier Diego Jacinto por la creación de este video.
They're taking charge of their identity. Why don't you celebrate that? I don't have to call myself Latinx, but look at them. They get to call themselves, we call ourselves Chicanos. They're the future, and we are the past. We've done our bit. Let's not control the discourse anymore. Let them control the discourse. Let them teach us.
That children, no matter what language they speak, no matter what's their background, what's their experience, they have all the tools and all the knowledge to be our own teachers and to be absolutely strong, perfect, happy, successful.
SDSU will host the second annual Reborder Conference, the premier annual collaborative event that explores key transborder binational issues and innovative solutions.
So welcome to the San Diego Dual Language Virtual Conference. This theme for the year is social justice, biliteracy, and multilingualism for all. We want you to know that this is a joint effort of 3 institutions, San Diego State University, Butte County Office of Education, and the San Diego County Office of Education.
Who gets to decide what American means? Stephen Yuan, the actor of the film, he said, we shouldn't be punished for telling different American stories that haven't been told before. And then why are Americans still considered perpetual or forever foreigners? For example, the question, where are you from? Because of the way we look, we're constantly asked, where are you from? And that they're not talking about that I'm from San Diego. They're talking about what my cultural background is.
The social amnesia is the struggle for us to remember our past. And so I've been a student of educational law and court cases that have impacted on our ability to maintain, to assure that our language and culture is respected, not as superior, but as co-equals, and that every child has a right to their cultura, su cultura y su idioma.
One of the things I learned, which I think served me well, is that I never was afraid to ask questions. I never was afraid to say what I didn't understand. And that is really important because there were times when I would not understand things and sometimes people would look at me like I was crazy. And then I'd be like, but no, I don't understand this. If you can't explain it to me, then you tell me who can.
I just want you to know what a pleasure and honor it is for me to spend time with you this morning.
I'm really, really happy that you're here. Es un gran placer estar aquí con ustedes.
Es un honor y es un privilegio estar con ustedes aquí. Muchísimas gracias por regalarnos unos minutitos de su tiempo. Your presence, your presencia es el regalo. So we appreciate this gift.
And hello, everybody. To close us out, I am Michael Wicker. I am the program director and director of teacher education and liberal studies from Southwestern College in Chula Vista, California. One of the things that we really want to kind of bring home with this with the Deber program is that This is very interinstitutional, and it's also cross-border. So the fact it sort of builds off this idea of mulmenya and academic mestizaje, where there's a constant mixture and a collaboration that sort of flows in and out between institutions. And the students that come to us from all 4 institutions belong to all of us. It's not just that we have students from Southwestern or from San Diego City or San Diego Mesa or San Diego State. They're all of our students. So one of the things we really want you to go home with today is that one of the most important things that we can do as part of the Deber Scholars Program is to create a third space that blends the most important aspects of home and community with the most important aspects of schools. And we do this in order to encourage a productive discomfort for all of our stakeholders. And that's important, that we have a productive discomfort, because we can get out of our comfort zones and we can move into something that's going to really, really impact the world. And in that space, the students, the staff, the faculty, administrators, and entire institutions will find themselves in a state of perpetual growth with one single goal in mind, that the various forms of health and wealth in our communities, regardless of which side of the border they were born, or regardless of which side of the border they reside, will flourish and become models for others. This work, developing the next generation of bilingual and multicultural teachers, will be done in service of others, and the world will truly see the beautiful lives and souls of our people. Esto es nuestro deber. Gracias.
All right, was that the last presenter for this group?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you all so much for this amazing work. Looking forward to the discussion. Great, so I'm gonna ask our attendees now, as well as the panelists, please go ahead and feel free to brainstorm those questions, comments, ideas. If you'd like to enter them into the chat, we will be able to answer questions one by one. And maybe I'll just kick us off to ask each of the presenters if you could share some reflections on some of the next steps that you envision with regards to the research and the programs that you've described here. And I'll ask Dr. Camargo maybe to start us off, please.
Well, thank you. Really thank you to all the presenters. I think it is very interesting to see how the diversity and that all of the programs and is important to know. In my research, I think we have to do more collaborative work. In my experience in this project, was very important to work with students at the UABC and San Diego State. They can share experiences, we can learn from each other, and we can understand better the conditions in those countries and how similar are certain conditions in the region, because really Mexicali and Calexico is, it's the same city, just with different names, each one, and the same thing with Tijuana and San Diego. There are many things that we could understand better if we kind of study or understand this as a region.
Thank you very much, Dr. Camargo. And now I'd like it to open it up to the debate team to reflect on some of the next steps you envision as part of the amazing work that you've described here today.
I'll start. Yo creo que unas visiones al futuro es como acabó el profe Michael Wicker, que es cómo podemos tener esa responsabilidad mutua a través de las instituciones, ver a nuestras alumnas más allá de su correo electrónico y si están registradas o no están registradas en nuestra universidad. Esto lo estamos haciendo ahorita en el proyecto de ver con el trabajo que profe Lisa Sparaco y colegas están haciendo con estudiantes mentores, y son personas que están en una universidad, pero están trabajando en otra universidad de una manera distribuida. Colegas, ¿otras perspectivas?
Well, I think one of the things going forward, this is Michael Wicker from Southwestern College, is as we have an opportunity to actually meet students in a physical space right now, it's very healing. It's very healing. I know that we have this limited time and things on our campuses because of COVID and other issues. So we have to be very mindful of that, of course. But Dr. Camargo, really brought to the front was that students are dealing with these traumas, and oftentimes sitting face to face with somebody, sharing water, pan dulce, having a Coke or conversation is such an important thing. And in these times, I think our students need that so much. They need that so much. And ultimately teaching, from where we're coming from, teaching is a very humanistic endeavor. And so we have to try to find spaces whenever possible to encourage that humanity and to build that humanity as much as possible.
And I'll just add that I know this wasn't brought up during our presentation, but one of the things that we take very seriously as the leadership team, and Dr. Maldonado mentioned that we grew from 6 to, I believe it's 18, but we as a leadership team, we take our own professional development very seriously. And so we have literature circles where we read texts closely, and then we chat about it. We call them our cafecito literarios. We're actually reading a book by Bell Hooks right now. And really the idea is that we are learners, and we're modeling ourselves as learners for our students, because we buy into that belief, right? Because we believe it and we want to model it. And I think it's the same with being vulnerable with them during this pandemic, sharing that, we're struggling too in a lot of ways. And so we've really focused on building community and building trust so that we can have these kinds of moments with these students that we're trying to support in getting their bilingual teaching credential.
Can I add some? Okay, Linda, go ahead.
Thank you. I just wanted to add, it's something I didn't mention in my time, but one of the things that I love about the VED is that every single leader that is part of the VED leadership expresses or shares that same passion and heart to help the students. So every time, even though our events have been virtual, but there's such a power and energy every time we connect. We have our required events once a month, and we have music, and we have culture. We celebrate culture, but we also always have the grounding in, just checking how everybody's doing. All these activities are very intentional. And I mean, there's so many things I can say, but I mean, just showing the students that we care. We know that they have their support systems at home, but for them to have a big support system on this side as well, from the institutional side, that we're there to encourage them, cheer them on, hear them out, and support them. So I'm just grateful to be part of this work. Thank you.
Y bueno, voy a agregar algo breve, si no me voy a sentir mal que fue el único que no agrego nada, pero como hice mención en mi sección, que son dos marcos los que se podría decir que se han utilizado, no exclusivo, no sea, la evaluación y la investigación, digamos, no se ha limitado a esos dos marcos, y como parte del equipo de evaluación e investigación, estamos en constante proceso de buscar qué otras fuentes pueden informar el trabajo de deber. Sabemos, por ejemplo, que San Diego State acaba de recibir el sello de excelencia, entonces también estamos, ¿qué otras prácticas se están implementando en esas instituciones que puedan servir a este proyecto para crear esa estructura de apoyo a los estudiantes? Por otro lado, también vemos, o sea, comparando proyectos, por ejemplo, en Arizona, en Texas, y sobre todo tomando en cuenta que estamos en la frontera, ¿no? Algo central a deber es la región fronteriza. Estamos ahorita en un evento, ¿no? de Reborder, una conferencia de la frontera. Entonces queremos saber qué se está haciendo también en Texas, que están universidades con tanta cercanía a la frontera, y cómo están ellos lidiando con estos problemas de los estudiantes que, como mencionamos, ¿no? Son estudiantes transfronterizos y navegan dos países, dos culturas, dos instituciones día a día, y se puede decir que es un problema, digamos, institucional o a nivel nacional, pero también es una fortaleza que es lo que alimenta este desarrollo positivo de identidad cultural y lingüística.
Thank you so much. Dr. Camargo, did you have something that you wanted to add earlier?
Yes, I was thinking about now you already kind of mentioned the last two speakers, but I think the bilingualism, the language, we have to kind of, it is very important that our students feel like we can understand them because the language somehow shows the different cultures and different music and all of this. And so I think this bilingualism and bilingual teaching and all of those things, I think it is very important because in the research and in my classes, I try to, and I encourage the students to use sources in both languages. And I think it is they feel like, oh my God, I can do this. It's very cool and those things. So I think it is very important, the language as a signal of acceptance and inclusion and diversity and all of those things.
I love that so much. Thank you, Dr. Camargo. You're doing my job for me, honestly. That's what I was seeing too across these presentations, and especially with the last presentation, thinking about, SDSU's commitment to diversity and inclusion and the ways in which this project really, really exemplifies those values. And it's just an incredible piece of work, and I think means a lot to the students. And it's really exciting to follow. And I appreciate you bringing that into your own classroom experience. That gives me a lot to think about too, in terms of what sources students are using in their work. So the other points that were mentioned that I think are really important is just around the pandemic and healing and trauma, and how we're supporting one another and coming together and building these, communities of care after this time of isolation and feeling so fragmented and uprooted, I know, for many of us. So I really appreciate the DeVere team's response to that. And I was wondering, Dr. Camargo, if you had any reflections around that in terms of working with your own research team through the pandemic and what that's been like, and how you've come together or communicated.
I have a colleague, two of my colleagues and I are working with something that we call narrative from detainees. So are those asylum seekers that are detained in the border, in any of these detention centers. And we are trying to understand through letters that they wrote the difference previous to the pandemic and during the pandemic. And really, it is really, how can I say that, is the level of trauma and how they describe the trauma is incredible. Because during the pandemic, the pandemic make it clear how the inequities in health because really impossibilities. When the incarcerated asylum seekers, most of them are poor and are, as I say before, I classify them as forced migration. And because we don't see middle and upper classes detained, most of these middle and upper classes are here, overstayed visas. And so there are some socioeconomic status that makes us as societies to punish more the poor. So in the pandemic, together with the pandemic, I think we have to come with solutions to that, the inequality, because healthcare is something that is really needed. And the poor is the most affected. They don't have insurance. If they have insurance, those insurance do not cover, much. So, and in the letters that we read from this project about narratives from detainees, they describe how in the COVID, before it is those situations happen, but during COVID, I mean, there is due process violations, right? They do not, everybody is entitled to law in this country, in the United States, right? So it should be respected. It is not, the country shouldn't say, you know, this is, during this time we will do this or respect the due process, and during this time not. It is an obligation. So how they are treated during the pandemic, how they were incarcerated without any other behavior different than cross the border. And as for asylum, which is their right, and they are kind of incarcerated with many people, and they for example say how at the beginning it was one person infected or two or three, but then they got almost everybody infected. So how to respond to a pandemic or to this population that are the most vulnerable of all?
Thank you for that. I want to make sure we get to some of the questions from the audience as well in the chat. So I'll turn my attention to those. If folks in the audience have questions, please add them. And then I'll pose those to the panelists and also ask the panelists as well for any reflections about what has been said. So we have a question here from Denise Marquez that Dr. Wicker has already addressed in the chat, but I'm wondering, Dr. Wicker, if you want to speak to this briefly. The question is, how do you navigate the concept of productive discomfort that occurs in conversations about sensitive topics such as immigration policy? And I honestly think this could even really apply to everybody that's presented and spoken here today. This is such an important question, and one that I constantly grapple with as a researcher and as an educator in this field as well. So I'm really looking forward to a discussion on this one. I'll let Dr. Wicker kick us off.
Well, thank you very much, and I appreciate anybody else who wants to jump in. Actually, and not doctor yet. I'm still in my program. I have a little bit longer to go. But this idea of productive discomfort really came out of the conversations we were having in our doctoral program with our cohort, because what I've started to find, it takes time. You get to know people in your cohort, and then you start to figure out a level of comfort and a level of authenticity that you can address issues with. And so this idea of productive discomfort came up just in general, where in order to grow, we have to leave our comfort zones, right? I mean, this goes into educational theory going back so far, but not so much that we throw up that wall, right? We have to be able to lower the affective filter so that we can actually address these issues and struggle through them. So I did write up a response to Denise, and then I'll try to paraphrase it a little bit. But really what it comes down to is being authentic to yourself and being able to have conversations about these things, whether it's immigration policy or any number of other issues, in a way that stays productive. The moment that it becomes destructive, the conversation ends. I mean, we might as well just burn the whole village down, to use a metaphor, is kind of what it does. If you take the scorched earth approach to anything, chances are there's going to be problems. So we have to keep it as though, we have to struggle through these, and we have to have real discussions. They have to be authentic, and we also have to listen to voices. And the idea, like the migrant narratives, these counter narratives, where we're seeing all this resistance to things like critical race theory today, where essentially they're saying we don't want to listen to the voices of the people who were actually oppressed, and so we need to be able to get beyond that. So let's listen to. We want to find out about immigration policies. Well, who's really affected by these policies? And let's hear their story. When we think about things, the children coming up from Central America, there's 100 years of United States intervention in that part of the hemisphere that has led to this point in time. And most people in the U.S. have no idea about that history. They have no understanding of what has gone on for over 100 years. So bringing that in, that leads to productive discomfort. It's not all of a sudden, tens of thousands of children, got on La Bestia and started moving north, just because, it's Tuesday. What else are we going to do? There's a whole history behind that. So to be able to have those kinds of conversations, but ultimately, I think it comes down to authenticity. It comes down to listening to the counter narratives, and let's listen to the people that things are actually happening to and are deeply, deeply affected by. And then the third piece of that is that they have to be productive. It can't be destructive discomfort. It has to be productive discomfort. And if we're not moving forward and we're not being productive and we're not taking the conversation into new places that become very pragmatic and solution oriented, then we're not doing it. Then we're doing a disservice and we're not helping. So I'll leave it at that. And I would love to hear some ideas from other people.
Well, I would just connect to what Michael said about the discomfort and the struggle with it, right? We want to make sure that there's, and one of the terms that folks are using in education right now is productive struggle, right? And it's similar, this idea that any kind of learning, we need to have some sort of productive struggle. And I think it becomes unproductive, like Michael's saying, when people feel so completely vulnerable that they don't even know where to start. But we also have to honor that we need brave spaces, not just safe spaces, because we talk about, we need to have these safe spaces so people feel comfortable, but that's not, we don't want you to feel comfortable necessarily, right? So I would say it's safe and brave, right? We want to be brave in being able to speak up and being able to share our truth, and not having people micromanage the way it comes out, right? We know that there's a lot of, and this is like really looking at intersectionality too, the ways in which like we communicate through our ethnic, racial backgrounds and our genders, and the list goes on. And I want to remind us that it's not just this global pandemic that we're dealing with, right? This year in 2020, we experienced a continuation of anti-Black racism in terms of a pandemic. We have these misinformation or disinformation campaigns, and that's a pandemic, right? And it was specifically around COVID-19, but also we see it with critical race theory right now that Michael referenced. And so we're trying to lean into all of this collective struggle that we're all going through if we're paying attention. And so and one way that the BED addressed that was in one of our virtual dialogue required events. We did an anti-racism 2-hour session. We also connected to the notion of intersectionality in our follow-up, so that we could lead with race, but also acknowledge that there are other ways of oppression that influence the way, the disparities with the pandemic, the disparities as you heard Saul speak to, Dr. Maldonado speak to, in terms of the ways in which some of our students here at the border are struggling through the pandemic. That's unique and is not necessarily similar to others around the country or even internationally, right? So I'll stop there.
I love the perspectives that have been shared so far. Denise, thank you again for that amazing question, because it led us into such an important discussion of intersectionality all the way through how we create these brave and safe spaces for learning about these often difficult to discuss, but hugely important topics of social justice. I wish I had the clapping and the heart emojis, because I was really moved hearing both of you speak. So thank you so much for that. I'm going to move on just to read a few of the other comments and questions here in the chat. So we have some comments from Karina Vidrio Mesa, who says, powerful statements from the DeBer leadership team. We appreciate all the love and support you offer each of us. For new interested students in the DeBer program, who should be their point of contact? And we have the website posted here for those who want more information from Sara Hernandez, who explained that interested students can contact Linda, who's on the call here to start. So the eligibility criteria are listed here in the chat. There's also an email address here for Linda. Next, Yoli Soler says, what are the resources for transfronterizo educators once they receive their credentials? And is there continued mentorship? I'm going to open that up to the DeBer team.
Yo puedo empezar. Gracias, Yoli, por esa pregunta y esa invitación y esa nueva responsabilidad, porque hasta la fecha no tenemos eso desarrollado, pero es muy importante decir lo siguiente. Nuestro interés es no solamente tener conexiones a la institución de SDSU. Nuestras colegas trabajan en 3 diferentes colegios y pueden cambiarse a licenciaturas en cualquier parte del estado o más allá del estado, y el apoyo continúa. siempre y cuando haya interés en la educación bilingüe. Y el único requisito es que apliquen para el programa de credencial después de su licenciatura en SDSU, porque este programa existe porque históricamente no hemos tenido la representación, el apoyo a nuestra comunidad que se transfiere de estas tres instituciones a la institución SDSU. Pero aplicar no significa un compromiso de inscribirse. Y yo creo que eso es importante, que tenemos esa póliza como un programa. Pero para contestarte, ahorita no tenemos esa realidad. Y quizás en la siguiente sesión, nuestra colega que está en Arizona, doctora Falcón Horta y otras colegas nos pueden decir acerca de otros tipos de programas e iniciativas que existen, pero ya nos diste más tarea y me gusta aprender de ustedes, así que gracias por la tarea. ¿Quieres ser maestra? Ya sabes, aquí tenés muchas alumnas para aprender de ti.
Gracias. Does anybody else have anything more that they'd like to add to that question, in response to that question? All right. I don't see any other questions or comments in the chat right now, so I'm going to open it up to the panelists as well to see if any of the panelists have questions or reflections for each other or anything else that folks would like to add.
Well, I will start, and as we kind of live in different realities, and it will be very interesting to know more about yours. For example, in the United States, I know my accent is very strong, and it is an issue here. You know, so I think for this discomfort and positive and negative, we also have to kind of live with those realities, because sometimes it's hard. It's just hard to understand how is that happen, right? 20 years after or something. So I think we kind of have different challenges, and I want to know what challenges do you see to this bilingual education and this in exchange, international exchange, because we really kind of have different or live in different realities. And as I in the United States, to be an immigrant, I am an immigrant, is hard. It's not always is kind of that word means not always is positive, the meaning, let's say. So I want to know about the challenges that you see in Mexico and other countries.
Sí, bueno, gracias, doctora Camargo. Uno de los problemas que veo particular en Estados Unidos en torno a la cuestión del multilingüismo es de que históricamente el país ha sido, se podría decir, monolingüe, ¿verdad? Nunca, en realidad, no se ha promovido una cultura que valore los otros lenguajes. Y esto ha dado también lugar a que las políticas educativas y también relacionadas con políticas de inmigración y culturales, sociales, estén muy arraigadas en este sentido de una sola lengua, y esto es el inglés. Entonces, yo creo que la dinámica en torno a la educación y al bilingüismo en Estados Unidos es única en el mundo, ¿no? Cuando vemos por ejemplo, en Europa, que se promueve el multilingüismo y vemos países o personas, ¿no? Ciudadanos de la Unión Europea que manejan 3, 4 lenguas sin dificultad, y para ellos es algo de lo más normal. Entonces, pero esto viene al punto que cómo la política y la cultura aquí en nuestro contexto hace eso difícil, ¿verdad? Porque no siempre ha sido este ambiente de bienvenido el multilingüismo. Por ejemplo, aquí en California, en los 90s, la proposición 227, ¿no? que limitó severamente la educación bilingüe en el estado, y eso causó que estuviera muy limitado el entrenamiento, los docentes bilingües. Se dio hace 4 o 5 años, ¿no? La proposición 58 que intenta revertir esos efectos, pero, o sea, se puede ver que son ciclos también históricos que van ligados también a la inmigración. Entonces, ahorita, actualmente creo que se está promoviendo más esta idea de multilingüismo y multiculturalismo, por lo menos en California, pero también vemos, ¿no? A nivel nacional la dinámica y los conflictos, las divisiones socioculturales, que es muy complicado. Entonces, y esto es inherente, siento que a la cultura y a la historia del país, de Estados Unidos, ¿no? Con esta estructura de gobierno descentralizada que también no permite que haya una política de lenguaje que unifique de cierta manera o que promueva una visión multicultural del país. Y bueno, creo que eso en lo personal me parece triste, ¿no? Que no se valore eso, sobre todo que vemos cómo más y más el país se hace más diverso. Entonces, esperemos que en un futuro proyectos como Deber y otros que se están implementando en otros estados sigan esa lucha, porque sí, es muy difícil, ¿no? Y yo creo que la dinámica en México también quizás es más relacionada a lenguas indígenas, ¿verdad? Porque allá en México se promueve el inglés como algo, como una oportunidad de prosperidad y de migración quizás, pero también los lenguajes indígenas están muy marginados en México y yo creo que eso también es algo que países de Latinoamérica deben de reflexionar, porque también cómo hacemos, si queremos crear este ambiente de inclusividad lingüística, ¿qué hacemos con esas lenguas que han sido históricamente eliminadas del mapa lingüístico?
Mariano, thank you. I really appreciate those comments, especially around Indigenous languages. That's something that we haven't talked a lot about today in this session yet. As a Canadian myself, we also have a significant Indigenous community with many diverse languages and that are also highly marginalized. And there are efforts now to, embed that into different types of education and to see that, cultural safety reflected more in education systems moving forward. So I think that's a really important and thought-provoking question that addresses a lot of the social justice topics and the discussion around inclusivity and intersectionality that have been raised today. So I think that's a good place to end the open discussion. I know we have just a few moments left before the break, but I would like to ask the panelists, maybe for each presentation, if we could have maybe folks just speak for a minute or two about any sort of final recommendations you'd like to make based on the work that you've shared with us today. So I'll go ahead again in the order of the presentations and start with Dr. Camargo, please, for your final recommendations.
Well, my presentation was about trauma and forced migration. And so my final reflection is, I think we have to kind of add more elements to our discussion about migration. For example, language, we just Mariano already talked about language, how discrimination by language in these borders, because one thing is to speak Spanish and English, but the indigenous languages are not recognized. No many people can help those migrants. So just think about trauma and how this trauma is those migrants endure is not doesn't have the origin just in the individual interaction, but the states. I think we have to kind of think about policy and programs and how could we force our states and people in general to think about the trauma this population endures.
Thank you so much. I'll open it up to you for a minute or two of recommendations from the debate team before we wrap up.
But I can go. I think we're going to just give one final statement. And so I think, there's a couple of things that have come out of this. One is, how do we help people and communities grow as opposed to destroying parts of them? How do we honor who they are, where they come from, things about their life, everything from language, food, dress, religion, etc. How do we take a look at that and actually honor those, not because we want them to be a certain way, but because they are what they are, and honor them for the beauty that their intrinsic beauty that's already there. And then another part of this is collaboration, and this is a big part of the Deber program, is that it comes out of collaboration. It's not just interinstitutional, it's international, it's interpersonal, it's all of these sorts of things. In some of my research, I came across a concept, it's a Yucateco concept called Mulmenya, and it is a big reason why the Spaniards were not able to conquer the Yucatan Peninsula for so long, because when the Spaniards came in and said, well, if you go fight the people in this village, you can take their land. And they were like, well, why would I do that? Because my cousin lives over there, essentially. And we sort of look at Deber in a similar way, that I'm not in competition with City College or Mesa College or San Diego State. We're not in competition with UABC, with CETIS. It's not the United States versus Mexico. It's not California, Alta California versus Baja California. We're all in this together, and everybody who comes here, it can all be part of this. And so the collaboration, the honest dialogue, and honoring people for who they are, from where they come from, because of their existence, and we finally figuring out what we can learn from them and what we can offer back in return, becomes this really beautiful exchange that is ultimately just this very human act that I think so many of us are really hungry for.
I love that. Well, on this note, let's end with reminding ourselves that we want to emphasize our humanity, collaboration, and creating these communities to support and care for one another, whether we're working across the education or health sectors. I think we've talked about some common issues across multiple sectors, and importantly, also how we need to bring together those conversations, that language should be a key part of any discussion around migrant health and inclusivity, for example. So I really appreciate the great work that all of the panelists have shared with us today. Many thanks as well also to the conference organizers for putting together this wonderful panel. I really appreciate everyone's contributions. Just quickly on housekeeping, the next session starts at 3:30 in the same room. And also please be aware that an exit survey will be sent to everyone at the end of the day, and we really appreciate everyone's participation to learn from your feedback. So thank you so much again, everyone, and take care.
Gracias, gracias.